Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast for our final segment of the show and the week, and most importantly, our bubble watch for March Madness this season. And we get into some of the low mid-major teams, potential Cinderellas as well, to conclude today's show. Now a lot of them are familiar faces, but they potentially are in unfamiliar territory for some of you. For example, who would have thought St. Mary's would be more of a lock to make the NCAA Tournament at this juncture of the season than the Gonzaga Bulldogs in the Western Coast Conference? We'll talk a little bit more about Utah State trying to make history in their program. We'll talk a little bit more about a team like San Diego State and how they can continue their ascension as one of the better mid-major conference teams in the country. And then a team like New Mexico, we have a lot, the list goes on and on to talk about for these low mid-major teams. But ultimately, kind of surprising to see certain teams not as certain to make the tournament as years past. But let's start off with the two locks that we are confident in saying will make the NCAA tournament out of these low mid-major conferences thus far. The Memphis Tigers really have turned the corner under Coach Penny Hardaway this season. And the reason why I think they're primed for a deep run is that they don't necessarily have players past years like Jalen Duren to carry them. And because of that, there's no noise surrounding them that they need to overperform and exceed expectations. They're right where they need to be, and Penny is coaching them at a high level. I really love the outside-inside duo of Dane Danger and PJ Haggerty on this team, and they're only going to grow under Penny Hardaway. He's instilled the philosophy of a winning culture at this program yet again. And I feel like that out of all the mid-majors that we can really talk about today, the Memphis could be the one that is a dark horse in March Madness, and you wouldn't even be surprised if they went into, at the very least, the Sweet 16 as your dark horse as well. And then let's talk about the surprise team. Not necessarily surprising because they've been gaining on Gonzaga over the past couple of years, finally kind of overtaken them a lot in people's minds in terms of who's the cream of the crop in the West Coast Conference. The St. Mary's Gales at 100%, or 99% just now, not fully there yet. But what I love about the St. Mary's Gales team is that they're a team of trees, man. This team is big man heavy. You have your experienced big man, which I really like, in Mitchell Saxon and Augustus Marciulionis. But they have even more guys when you look at this roster waiting for their roles as big men in the West Coast Conference. And that's what I love about this team. You don't often see a team like St. Mary's go far in the tournament with a team loaded at the center position, but I feel like they can make a lot of teams uncomfortable that way, playing through the force down low. And that's why, in terms of these lower mid-major conferences, it's always important to analyze the rosters of these respective teams when you're making decisions in your bracket on who to choose as your potential Cinderella. For Memphis, it's more of the classic inside-outside duo. They kind of play more like a power conference team than anyone in the mid-major conferences. But for St. Mary's, you should be definitely appealed by a team with that many big men. Because in college basketball, yes, it's starting to become a little bit more center-centric, so to speak, but not to the extent of St. Mary's. And that's potentially the reason why Gonzaga is losing a lot of its luster. It's because St. Mary's is doing things that not a lot of college teams are willing to do, play with big men. We see it in power conferences. Michigan's been doing it to a T this season. We see how potentially in other situations where you're not necessarily center heavy like North Carolina, you falter and ultimately have to potentially win your conference tournament to get in. So I always say that if you're looking at a mid-major team, always note who's on the roster and at what positions, most importantly. Sometimes scoring averages, stats don't matter. It's about the complexion and makeup of the team that really stands out when you're making these decisions for your bracket. Now let's talk with the team St. Mary's has, quote-unquote, beaten out as a top team in the West Coast Conference. Still a top team themselves, but not necessarily at the level of years past. The Gonzaga Bulldogs. They don't really, in my mind, have that elite player that can win a game like they have in recent years. They don't have, quote-unquote, a Jalen Suggs type player in their ranks. I don't have a Drew Timme in their ranks, I don't think. They do have an elite big man in Graham Ike, and Ben Gregg is holding his own, and Ryan Nembhard is a fantastic distributor of the basketball, 9.9 assists average this season. But the reason why they're not as elite in years past is because they have trouble simply beating the elite teams. They are 1-5 against the BPI's top 50 opponents, and they really, in the West Coast Conference, don't necessarily have the schedule and the pedigree outside of who they play in the non-mid-majors. I think that Gonzaga's looking at a chance where if they don't win their conference tournament, it could be between them and St. Mary's. And I feel like, though it's tough to leave them out because they still look good in all the rankings and ratings that, appeal to the selection committee, I just feel like this is not your early 2020s Gonzaga team, late 2010s Gonzaga team. I feel like they have a lot of talent, but it's not the kind of talent that sways you in terms of thinking that this team can, like teams of Gonzaga's past, go on deep runs. And that's what kind of separates them ever so slightly in my mind from the locks of the mid-majors and them right now, because they don't really have that resume-boosting win for their squad. Now let's talk a little bit more about the Utah State Aggies. I kind of had to fill time last segment to get ahead in this segment, but I really like the profile of this Utah State team just because they're on a kind of a run in their program's history. This will be their third consecutive NCAA tournament trip if they make it. They have the highest SRS rating in program history. They have a 9-3 record against top 100 competition, but I feel like they're all over the place in terms of where they stand. They play in a very interesting conference in the Mountain West where you have teams like San Diego State and Boise State who could still be considered for the selection committee as well. But I do think that very balanced roster as well. Not necessarily one relying too much on one player, which I really like. And ultimately, they have a lot of confidence. Ian Martinez, an elite player. Mason Falslev, another great guy to have down low. But ultimately, this Utah State team is trying to become one of those mid-majors who can be consistent in terms of their NCAA tournament appearances. And what I like about them is that in a Mountain West Conference that could be changing in the very near future in terms of not just football but potentially basketball, Utah State could gain an advantage in that respect as well. So look out for this team as the Mountain West landscape in certain sports changes in their favor. Then let's talk about the team competing against them for Mountain West supremacy this season, the San Diego State Aztecs. I really like this Aztecs team a lot. 48th in net. They're 42nd in strength of record. They have an 8-3 conference record, which selection committees really love, but they are kind of a toss-up just because I feel like the Mountain West Conference, even being the conference that in the mid-majors will probably produce the most teams, might not necessarily be inclusive for a team like San Jose State, because the number of teams from the Mountain West is dropping, even though it remains above, say, the A10 threshold, the MVC threshold. So I'm looking at San Diego State as someone to really look out for in terms of not just the conference tournament, the regular season itself, because that would really boost their resume in my eyes. So, San Diego State again, another appealing team with an inside-outside duo to look out for so they make the tournament in Miles Bird and Magoon Guath. But overall, still a team in my eyes that really needs that resume-boosting win to really overcome that threshold and ensure that they have an opportunity to make the tournament. But in terms of the mid-major picture here, in recent years, you view the mid-majors as how you kind of deciphered what you would do with your bracket, right? Because a lot of the time, you can find a potential underdog in the power conferences, but not to the extent of, say, a mid-major team that has a talent to go at least 2 weekends. This year, I can kind of see a difference, a major difference between even the weakest of the power conferences and the mid-majors. And that could be a concern to you when you're building your bracket. So, like I just did for these segments, if you're willing to hedge your bets on a mid-major in this year's March Madness tournament, you would have to assess the roster, assess the matchup they get in the first round, and say, is this team capable of pulling it off? Because I feel like a lot of mid-major talent are either transferring to power conference or trying their luck in, say, the G League. So I do feel that's where I kind of see mismatches for these mid-majors going up against these elite power conference teams. And now that there's a lot of depth in them, I'm really intrigued to see how the mid-major teams handle these very deep power conferences and their elite teams. So it's definitely going to be weird to see how a lot of these teams handle it, even the cream of the crop in these conferences. But I do feel like there's not really one that stands out to me in terms of potential Cinderella. Maybe VCU, maybe, USU this year. But I can't really say because I can see that big of a chasm between them and the power conferences. But let me know what you think in the comments below, because that will just about do it for today's show, the Bubble Watch segments, and the week here on the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. Thank you all for tuning in throughout the week. I've been Chris Shepard. We'll be back Monday, 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, as always, for another great week of shows. But other than that, out for today. See y'all next week.